for biodiversity, but also add significant amount of carbon to the atmosphere and remove a considerable cooling effect on the regional climate as well as the global climate. Then there are a bunch of other systems on this map, which if we tip them, it might not change the whole kind of climate configuration, but many hundreds of millions of people would care about it. That includes tipping a collapse of the West African monsoon, which would be a humanitarian disaster, or tipping the loss of those coral reefs that I mentioned previously, or thawing the permafrost that releases significant amounts of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere, adding to global warming. So recently we assessed not only what were those tipping points that we could cross, but how close are they and what's our uncertainty around that, expressed in the yellow to red burning ember scale here, where the y-axis is the global warming in centigrade. And the grey line here is the current level of warming. The dotted lines are our best estimates based on reviewing over 200 studies in the published literature over the last 15 years. Best estimates of where the tipping points lie. And you see the closest ones are for those big ice sheets on Greenland and West Antarctica, the coral reefs and the permafrost. But there's other systems like deep convection I mentioned in the Labrador Sea that could be tipped at low levels of warming below 2 degrees centigrade. The dark grey line here with the shaded area around it is the 2.7 degrees centigrade of global warming that current policy commitments worldwide, such as they are, will be taking us to later this century. And you can see and count it up for yourselves that if we continue to that level of warming, I think at least 13 systems are at risk of tipping. Several we'd be fairly sure had long since tipped. And perhaps the biggest and most dangerous of all, tipping the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, would be already at significant risk. So just to emphasize what that particular risk means, this is taking climate model output where the Atlantic overturning circulation collapses in a 2.5 degrees centigrade warmer world, and showing that that would more than halve the viable area for growing the major staple crops, wheat and maize worldwide, including major reductions in the viable growing areas in the US. So that, in simple terms, would be a food security crisis worldwide, and it would be because there's an underlying water security crisis going on, as the patterns of climate had shifted fundamentally to make conditions considerably less habitable and favourable for growing our favourite staple crops. So these climate tipping points are arguably the biggest risk we're running in a changing climate, and we've left it too late for incremental action to significantly reduce the risks they pose. The only way we can control what I consider an existential risk is to radically accelerate our actions to decarbonize the economy, which is another way of saying stop all fossil fuel burning and also stop the land use changes tied to our diet and food systems that are driving greenhouse gas emissions. And we can happily, as a note of hope, we can see that to go from the current state of the economy, the business as usual state, to a zero emissions economy is possible, and that we also see the evidence that the social behaviors and technologies that are needed to go from one state to the other, they can have an accelerating uptake because there are what I call positive tipping points that can create a self-propelling change towards uptake of solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, and all the rest of it. So my closing message would be what the US needs to do beyond the progress it's already made with the Inflation Reduction Act is to make even more decisive policy changes that can bring forward those positive tipping points that would accelerate the reduction and shutdown of greenhouse gas emissions that we need to limit the risk that is a profound risk from the climate tipping points.
Excellent, Professor Lenton. Thank you for your contribution. I know you're not with us now, but perhaps you will listen to the archive. We really appreciate that, and what a surprising graph that was, showing the movement over just 12 years from the belief that tipping points may be breached at 3 to 4 degrees warming to now just thinking that they are commencing to be breached at just a little over 1.4. All right, now our next speaker is Rob Jackson. Welcome, Rob. Rob is a Stanford professor. He's a climate scientist, and he is chair of the Global Carbon Project, actually a very important international group which tracks emissions of greenhouse gases worldwide. And Rob, you have 6 minutes for your presentation, if you would. Thank you very much for coming.
All right. But that's red now. Is it on?
Yeah, red is on.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Eric. I knew some of what Hayward had done, but not all of it, so thank you and the city for all your work. Thanks for the chance to speak today. I'm Rob Jackson, a Stanford professor, climate scientist, and chair of the Global Carbon Project, an international group that tracks emissions of greenhouse gases worldwide. The views expressed today are my own. I'm speaking in support of the CPR initiative's position that the EPA and the US government broadly should use every responsible and reasonable authority to phase out the production, distribution, and use of fossil fuels and their associated greenhouse gas emissions. The stated mission of the EPA is to protect human health and the environment. Their mission statement also requires them to ensure that Americans have clean air, land, and water, and that national efforts to reduce environmental risks are based on the best available scientific information. Decades, really centuries, of the best available scientific information show that climate change is real and that burning fossil fuels is causing it. Before we explore trends in greenhouse gas levels, though, let's touch briefly on climate change itself. The world's 2 warmest days on record just occurred a few weeks ago on July 21st and 22nd. 2023 was the warmest year on record. The warmest decade on record was also the most recent decade. Climate change is here. And we're already paying for it. Right, the federal agency NOAA has been tracking billion-dollar weather disasters in the US since the early 1980s. Adjusted for inflation, billion-dollar disasters happen 7 times more often today than they did in the 80s, and they cost us 7 times more, now $150 billion a year. Last year, 2023, shattered the previous US record for most disasters. We were relatively lucky in California, as you can see from the figure, but our reprieve won't last. Greenhouse gas levels are driving these increases in extreme weather and disasters. Concentrations of every major greenhouse gas are still rising. Methane concentrations in our air have more than doubled since the start of the Industrial Revolution and rose faster in the last 5 years than ever before. Nitrous oxide concentrations keep rising, and emissions increased an additional 40% since 1980. Carbon dioxide concentrations in our air are 1/5 higher today than they were in 1990, but CO2 emissions are 60% higher over the same period. No major greenhouse gas has even stabilized in the Earth's atmosphere, let alone started falling. And the same is true for emissions. Emissions of every greenhouse gas are still rising today. This can't continue. Right, cumulative emissions have taken us to the brink of a 1.5 C global temperature increase, and we're hurtling towards 2 and 3 degrees C. Heaven help us. The EPA must use every reasonable authority to phase out the production and use of fossil fuels and their emissions. And fossil fuel pollution isn't just warming the Earth, it's literally killing us. Particulate pollution from coal and cars in the US still kills more than 100,000 Americans a year, mostly through heart and lung diseases. Globally, 1 in 5 deaths is caused by burning fossil fuels, 10 million senseless deaths a year when cleaner, safer fuels are available. The EPA's job is to protect us. Their failure is discouraging because of a history of environmental success stories. Since EPA banned sales of leaded gasoline, lead levels in the blood of our children dropped 96%. The global ban on leaded gasoline saves us $2.5 trillion a year and has literally made us smarter. Lead pollution from burning gasoline lowered the IQ of hundreds of millions of people born in the last century. The Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone shield is the world's greatest success. Phasing out ozone-destroying CFC gases saved billions of skin cancers and cataracts worldwide, along with the many degrees of warming that would have come from these superpowered greenhouse gases. And finally, half a century of action through the bipartisan U.S. Clean Air Act continues to save hundreds of thousands of American lives a year at a 30-fold return on investment. Our workers are healthier and more productive. We breathe easier and pay lower medical expenses related to air pollution. I'm an optimist. My first homework assignment in every class is for students to find things about the environment that are better today than they were 50 or 100 years ago. The list of successes is long. Even beyond the examples I just gave, life expectancy and childhood mortality have improved. Global poverty has declined despite the injustices that remain.
1 minute.
My new book, Into the Clear Blue Sky, just published last week. It describes how we can restore the atmosphere in the same spirit we use to restore habitats and endangered species. The Endangered Species Act, it doesn't stop at saving plants and animals from extinction. It mandates recovery. When we see gray whales breaching on their way to Alaska each spring, grizzly bears ambling across a Yellowstone meadow, bald eagles and peregrine falcons soaring overhead, we celebrate life and a planet restored. Our goal for the atmosphere should be the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Jackson, may I ask one follow-up question?
Of course.
Considering cumulative emissions and the United States' leading role in this regard, would you say that our nation bears any special responsibility to try to lead the way away from calamity?
Unfortunately, I would, and I say that based on the historical numbers of emissions. If you look at the atmosphere as a whole, 1/4 of the carbon dioxide pollution floating around up there is attributable to burning fossil fuels in our country. So, and we are the world leader in that respect. So yes, I think we bear a responsibility today as one of the world's greatest emitters now, but we are also the greatest legacy emitter in the world.
Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
All right. Our next speaker is Daniel Swain. Professor Swain is a climate scientist at UCLA, studying how extreme events are changing on a warming Earth. He's also the principal of the notable blog Weather West. I strongly, highly recommend it. It provides real-time perspectives on California weather and climate, and we are especially appreciative that Daniel's with us today because he's been a little busy commenting and tracking the progress of the Park Fire, among others. Daniel, are you with us?
I am indeed. Hopefully you can hear me.
Thank you very much. We can hear you well.
Great.
You have approximately 7 minutes, Daniel.
All right, many thanks. I think the lead into this, from what we've just heard from the other presenters so far tonight, I think provides some good background for the big picture and the global view on what's going on. So what I wanted to do was offer a more California-centric perspective on things. I too am a climate scientist, but my focus is more on the actual atmospheric extremes that can occur in a warming planet, and specifically what that looks like in this part of the world. So really, I just sort of want to cut to the chase with the thing that I think is going to cause, in many ways, the most challenges in a warming California and perhaps beyond is this notion that I'm increasingly introducing of the expanding atmospheric sponge in a warming climate. And all of this comes down to some pretty old thermodynamics and science dating back well over 100 years, closer to 200 years. So this is something that we have known essentially since long before there were anything such as climate models in the mix. But a warmer air has the capacity to hold more water vapor at saturation. And if that sounds technical, I really think this analogy is helpful in thinking about this, because what happens in effect is that the atmosphere, as it warms, acts like a progressively larger sponge. You may have heard about the Clausius-Clapeyron relation, which tells us that this effect is exponential and that the size of the effective sponge increases by about 7% per degree centigrade, or 3 to 4% per degree Fahrenheit of warming. That's if you recall, that's equivalent to compound interest, and we'd all be pretty happy to have 7% compound interest in a savings account. But of course, in this case, the consequences are quite different. Many folks are familiar with this idea in the sense that in a warming climate, a warmer atmosphere can produce more extreme precipitation events, so heavier downpours and increased risk of flooding. But it also works like a sponge the other way around, where a progressively larger sponge can also evaporate or soak up more water from a wet countertop in the literal example, or really the entire landscape, the soil, the vegetation, bodies of water in a warming climate in this analogy. And the challenge here is that this gives us both a higher ceiling on how much water can fall out of the atmosphere as rain, but also a higher ceiling on how rapidly that water can go back into the atmosphere forced by evaporation. So this is a process that I and my colleagues have started to call hydroclimate whiplash, and there's lots of evidence that this is increasing in a warming climate, California and beyond. And in California, you may have heard conversations about how average precipitation is going to change, and the uncertainty surrounding exactly what the average precipitation may look like in a warmer climate. And what is remarkable, and this has held true now for the better part of a decade or more, is that even though we don't have a great sense of how California's overall annual average precipitation may change, and by the way, it has not decreased or increased over the past century in a meaningful way, we actually do have a pretty strong sense of how the most extreme years will look in the future. And despite that uncertainty or that little mean change in average precipitation, there's now quite a lot of evidence that that precipitation whiplash, those swings between extremely wet conditions on the one hand and extremely dry conditions on the other, is already beginning to increase. And this is starting to become an observational reality, but has for some time now been a projection that we can glean both from theory and from climate models. What does that mean in practice? Well, in California, many of you are familiar with the notion of atmospheric river storms, which deliver, on the plus side, on the beneficial side, most of California's water supply in terms of our big winter storms that drop a lot of rain and snow in the Sierra. But also, these are responsible for our most extreme precipitation events and nearly all of our destructive flood events in this part of the world. So the balance of benefits versus harm from these atmospheric rivers is very much dictated by how intense they are. And in a warming climate, because of that expanding atmospheric sponge, we are going to be seeing significantly more intense atmospheric rivers. In fact, there's some research suggesting that once we get up toward about 2 degrees centigrade of global mean warming, which, as the previous presenters have emphasized, we are still on a track to substantially surpass, we will start to see atmospheric rivers that drop unprecedented amounts of rainfall, with all the consequences that come from that. But we've also been seeing, of course, more intense heat waves. In fact, the heat wave this July, literally the month previous to me creating these slides, it doesn't even show up yet on this chart, was the singularly hottest month on record in California. That multi-week heat wave that affected interior parts of the Bay Area to some extent, but really the most inland and higher elevation parts of California with their hottest month in well over a century, and quite frankly, most likely in a much longer period of time than that. Summers are already considerably hotter than they used to be. That was true even before this summer happened, and we're seeing faster warming away from the coast and at higher elevations. This year was okay. We're also seeing these worsening droughts driven by, again, this expanding atmospheric sponge, as I mentioned. All of this together is really amplifying the risk of significant wildfires in this part of the state. Another thing we're seeing really escalate pretty dramatically in recent years as this expanding atmospheric sponge demands more water from the vegetation on the landscape. And we've already seen a doubling in the most extreme wildfire burning conditions in California since 1980. So just to close, a few final thoughts. California, our present and future, are going to be increasingly characterized by hydroclimate whiplash, and that means more severe floods, droughts, and wildfires as a result, as well as heat waves. And so co-managing these risks are going to be key to resilience. And climate mitigation, as we've heard about, is, of course, critically important, solving the underlying problem of warming by reducing and eventually coming close to zeroing out that carbon pollution accumulation in the atmosphere. But what I wanted to emphasize tonight is that we also simultaneously need to be thinking more seriously about climate adaptation, which is minimizing the negative effects of that warming that we know is coming down the pipeline. And so it's not an either-or proposition. We really do need to be doing both. And so I think with that, I will close.
Thank you very much, Daniel. First of all, I want to say to you and to everyone participating that we will keep our record open of this hearing. And so if you wanted to provide any additional materials, you are welcome to do this. Daniel, is there any hope in sight to arrest and perhaps close down some of the enormous fires that are now afflicting many parts of the West, including Northern California, as the global system moves from out of the present El Nino period?
Well, in the short term, I mean, I think the challenge is there are good years and bad years regionally, and there's sort of switch off from year to year. Some regions on Earth see big wildfire seasons and years that other places see quite mild seasons. So there's often sort of these dipoles that exist of locations with very active or not so active fire activity, depending on the long-term climate conditions. And it's also important to remember that, wildfire in many of the places where they are common is an important part of the natural environment. Wildfires are an inherently natural process. The problem is we've really cranked up the temperature at the same time that we've modified other aspects of these potentially flammable environments, all while we have more people than ever potentially in harm's way. So I think the challenge is going to be there will be good years and bad years, as I mentioned, in terms of fire in the North American West and elsewhere. But I think learning to manage this at scale is going to involve learning to embrace, to a certain extent, more fire in a warming world. We know that that's going to happen. The question is, how can we decouple some of these wildfires from the catastrophes that they've been associated with recently by engaging in things like larger scale prescribed burning and thinking more in a more circumspect way about how we design our communities or sort of retrofit everything from individual structures up to community scales to make them so that the consequences of these sorts of events aren't as severe as they sometimes are today.
Thank you, Daniel. Really appreciate your presentation today.
Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely.
All right, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We have Lauren Weston, Executive Director of Acterra. Acterra is an environmental nonprofit and a partner of the City of Hayward. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, everybody. Good to be in person. I don't know if this is actually going to work. Maybe I need to double this up. You can see I've done this a lot recently. I am Lauren Weston, Executive Director of Acterra, Action for a Healthy Planet. And Our mission is to bring people together to create local solutions for a healthy planet. We do this by serving the whole Bay Area. We were founded in 1970 and we're headquartered in Santa Clara County, but we serve 8 and sometimes 9 counties of the Bay Area across multiple types of programs. And I'm here tonight to talk about what more the United States should do to address climate change and the climate crisis. And our answer to that is accelerating an equitable transition. For us, the answer is centered in community. We must accelerate an equitable transition. And how do we do this? The 3 things we want to focus on in our equitable transition is, of course, voting for climate-friendly officials, supporting and endorsing climate-friendly initiatives, which happen locally and globally, and getting involved in local programming. And of course, I'm biased on the last one because I run a nonprofit that does local programming. To meet the needs of our communities, Actera creates and runs science-backed programs in both food, urging plant-based diets, and responsible waste management, and electrification, 2 of the largest areas of greenhouse gas emissions in the Bay Area. We focus on 2 key levers here: individual behavior change and advocating for solid climate-related policy. None of our work happens without intersectionality. Where food and electrification overlap, interestingly, is in cooking and in transportation. Our beneficial electrification program centers on decarbonizing our homes, businesses, and transportation. And to explain a little bit more about this, I'll talk about our Carl Knapp Go EV program, which is closely tied to Stanford. And Mr. Jackson has been, he doesn't know this, but I fangirl his work and have learned a lot from his work, so please check out his book. Our Carl Knapp Go EV program centers on public policy and advocacy, intentionally driving deep understanding of transportation needs and how electric vehicles can meet those needs while also shaping equitable policies. Cars sit unused 95% of the time. Actera knows this and activates conversations and solutions through the intersections of housing. How close are we to our workplace? How close are we to being able to run errands? Public transportation, so that we can do those without a vehicle, and biking, making those short trips more manageable. To do the bulk of trips within 3 miles of our homes, further reducing the need for cars. But if cars are necessary, which we know in our day and age they are, and for most of us that have long Bay Area commutes, it's even more necessary, we focus on transitioning gas vehicles to plug-in hybrids or all-electric vehicles, and we do this work in multiple ways, across multiple languages, and in multiple communities across the Bay Area. Particularly, we leverage volunteers. We have over 140 EV ambassadors that show people what it's like to own an EV, to get into an EV. They actually open up their EVs for you to sit in, to drive, to test them out. We have wonderful volunteers for the organization. We do financial incentive clinics that focus on helping income-qualified individuals access rebates, both in the state and federally, to get them into electric vehicles that meet the needs of their families. We also just finished a voucher program for the city of Mountain View, and we served 87 income-qualifying individuals with fully funded e-bikes in its first round, which we're very excited about.
1 minute.
Thank you. We also do EV consultations, supporting folks getting into vehicles one-on-one, which is fantastic, and we do that through public events, which you're all invited to. Visit our website. Key areas of focus for us are health and equity, financial security and well-being, and climate stabilization, which we've talked a lot about tonight in other presentations, so you can kind of skip ahead to the quotes and read those. I'm assuming this will be shared. I want to talk about breaking down the barriers. One is the lack of familiarity with EVs. We want to make sure that folks are educated on what it means to get into an electric vehicle, and even school buses and other types of electric transportation. Financial and language limitations. We do a lot of our work in multiple languages to make it more accessible. Lack of or misdirected political will, and the paucity of affordable EVs on the market. And above all, making sure that we have EV charging accessible to folks that have access to parking stations in their housing, either single family or multifamily. And I'll end with policy advocacy, which is kind of the leading indicator for us on how we make change. We want to focus on Cal Green codes and updating the statewide policy. Back in 2013, only 3% of multifamily housing parking spaces were EV capable. What we're proposing in the triennial cycle for 2025 is 100% of new apartment and condo units having access to an EV-ready parking space, but more progress is needed to tackle existing buildings and workplace charging. And we're hoping to encourage that states continue to adopt that across the United States, not just California. And I will end with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Tremendous work. Will Burns is next. He will be by Zoom. Will is an adjunct professor within Northwestern's Master of Science in Energy and Sustainability program, and he's a visiting professor with Northwestern University's program in Environmental Policy and Culture. He is also a founding co-director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University, and of course he is also a member of the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative's Board of Advisors. Will, thank you very much for joining us. Are you here?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much. And Will, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, let's see. I am trying to, can you see my screen also?
Indeed, we can see it.
All right. So Professor Jackson adverted a bit to this issue a couple of minutes ago, and I just want to amplify his comments, which is we have reached a point because we did not get our act together in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in my generation, my parents' generation, and quite frankly, in the current generation, to a point where if we're going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, holding temperatures to, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius and aspirationally at least holding temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we now need to aggressively decarbonize our economy, but also remove substantial amounts of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. And this refers to a concept that we call carbon dioxide removal. And this is a working definition, right? It's human-based activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and then durably store it. Durably is defined as somewhere between 100 and 1,000 years in geological, terrestrial, ocean reservoirs, or to utilize it in products. And we have reached a point where the amount of carbon that must be removed from the atmosphere is daunting. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has estimated that if we're to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, we're probably going to have to remove around 10 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere annually by the time we reach 2050, and perhaps as much as 20 billion tons by the year 2100, in addition to rapidly decarbonizing the world's economy. And this needs to be done through both nature-based sort of approaches, such as afforestation and reforestation, efforts to sequester more carbon in soils, such as through the use of approaches such as no-till agriculture, and also through the use of so-called industrial processes, such as direct air capture, which utilizes large fans to draw in CO2 into filtration systems to separate CO2 out from other ambient constituent elements of the air and ultimately store that CO2. As I indicated, we need to do this at a very large scale, and we need to be doing this in the near term, the midterm, and the long term. In the near term, efforts to remove CO2 from the atmosphere can help us buy time as we seek to decarbonize the world's economy and not pass critical thresholds. And the more CO2 that we can draw from the atmosphere, the longer we have to be able to decarbonize the world's economy, which is an extremely daunting task in itself, especially in certain sectors. In the medium term, to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement of trying to balance emissions with sinks, things that take up carbon dioxide, we're going to need substantial amounts of carbon removal because there's certain sectors such as steel and aviation and agriculture where wringing out all of the greenhouse gas emissions will be very difficult, very expensive, and in some cases impossible. And carbon removal can help us to effectuate those goals. And then in the long term, we ultimately want to reduce our atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases below where they are now. At 425, 427 parts per million, we're already seeing serious negative manifestations of climate change. And carbon removal in the longer term, once we have decarbonized most of the world's economy, can help us to start to reduce atmospheric concentrations of CO2 back to safer historical levels, such as 350 parts per million, maybe 300 parts per million.
1 minute.
At the same time, we need to ensure that carbon removal does not get in the way of decarbonizing the world's economy. We call this a so-called moral hazard. And there's ways that we can do that. California, for example, has a piece of legislation that's currently pending called SB 308, which would establish separate targets for reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases and also provide a mandate to pay for reductions of concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere to ensure that we meet both of those targets. And it would ensure that the polluters that have produced these greenhouse gas emissions would ultimately pay, and that we would start this program almost immediately so that we can start availing ourselves of economies of scale and learning by doing so that we can bring costs down for these approaches, many of which are ultimately very costly, to a point where we can achieve these goals by the year 2100. And California, because it is advancing this legislation, as it has many times in the past in terms of environmental policy, can serve as a laboratory and a model for doing so. And so it's my hope that Californians will embrace this approach and help to lead the world in terms of addressing climate change, both through carbon mitigation as well as carbon removal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will, very much. One short question, if I could. Exciting about the California proposal. Is there anywhere in federal law or in any other state where there is any requirement that the major polluters, such as Exxon and ConocoPhillips and Chevron, for instance, either remove or pay to remove any substantial share of the so-called legacy greenhouse gas emissions that they've injected into the atmosphere?
There is not, and that's a major problem. Right now, when we look at carbon removal, we're relying on the kindness of strangers. We have a couple of corporations, including Microsoft and JP Morgan, that are buying carbon removal, but that's on a voluntary basis, and it's extremely modest. Right now, we're effectuating about 0.001% of all of the long-term carbon removal that's necessary, and we're not seeing the number of companies that are trying to do this growing. And so as a consequence, there's a clear need for federal mandates, and I think from a moral standpoint, a clear, compelling rationale to require companies that are creating the impacts associated with climate change to clean up the atmosphere.
Will, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
All right. Next on our list, we have Sean McFarland, but I do not see Sean here. So I would like to introduce my friend, Professor Karina Garbisi. Professor Garbisi is a professor emerita and former chair of the Environmental Studies Department at CSU East Bay.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here. I'm very proud of what you all have done in Hayward and really appreciated the partnership we've had in working towards climate solutions. I'm not going to use any slides today. I want to share a more human story because in 1986, I entered the Energy and Resources Group, which was run by a man named John Holdren, who later became President Obama's science advisor, and he was the architect of Obama's climate plan, which was, of course, completely gutted by the Trump administration shortly thereafter. And so some of those dynamics are coming in here. I don't have to convince anyone in this room, I hope at this point in time, that we're facing a fossil fuel sourced crisis that's going to mean horrendous human suffering, and that this is our last opportunity to, shield our children from that, right? But I want, and of course, I join everybody in begging the EPA to do everything they can do to phase out fossil fuels. But I want to ask ourselves why that hasn't been done yet, and ask ourselves why it is such a big ask of EPA decision makers to do that, and then what we need to do to get beyond that. Professor Jackson raised the issue of ozone depletion, rightly, as being something that we successfully kind of turned around actually in less than 10 years after the international community originally got together and said, we're facing a situation that could end life on Earth as we know it. Admittedly, the climate problem has been a little slower, but that is not the essential reason. Within a couple years of the international community coming together and then the ozone protocol being signed, the CFC industry, the industry that produced all the chemicals that were causing the ozone depletion, aerosols and refrigerants, they were on board for banning CFCs. Why? Because enormous profits were to be made making all those substitute chemicals, right? The fossil fuels that still lay in the ground are sort of too rich a prize for industry to walk away from, and that was also initially voluntarily when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in 1992. Right? So it's a completely different dynamic. So I had personal experience that kind of helped me understand this when I was in about 2009, 2010, when the Obama administration was taking over. A friend of mine asked me to take over the technical analyses for rulemakings for energy efficiency standards. Of course, the Obama administration, arguably both in first and second administration, were keenly interested in pursuing that as one of their carbon emissions reduction strategy, as their least cost carbon emissions reduction strategy. Yet,
1 minute.
By and large, it didn't happen. And why is that? Can you imagine if you're a middle manager and you make the decision to make an aggressive change in policy? In this case, we're asking EPA officials to make an aggressive change to basically ban fossil fuels, right? And it has to be done if we care about the planet. What happens when Trump is elected into office? All of those heads roll. And I've seen that happen over and over. I was protecting a whistleblower actually even during the Obama administration. And those managers who make that decision, even if they have a supportive administration at the time, they feel like they can't do that because they are risking their jobs and their family incomes. So we have to support those people at the EPA who are willing to do that. And most critical on that is this coming election in November. It is the most important thing that any of us can do if we care about this timing, is to support Kamala Harris and basically a continuation of climate action as opposed to an administration that would completely turn this around, that has supported coal mining, electric utilities with fossil fuels, and all of the other things we hold precious, like education. So that's my 4.5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, is Helen Fitzmaurice here? Thank you very much, Helen, and you have 4.5 minutes.
All right. Thank you. So before I introduce myself, I'm going to pause and ask you 2 questions. And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to think about it. What is climate education for? That's my first question. And what should it look like? That's my second question. I already wasted 20 seconds, so you have 10 more seconds to figure that out. All right, so I don't have a slide deck, but I'm gonna ask you to picture a few things. The first thing I'm gonna ask you to picture is 75%. And I'm gonna ask, instead of thinking about a pie, I want you to think of 4 teenagers sitting around a table. 3 out of those 4 teenagers across the US experience anxiety related to climate change in a way that impacts them on a weekly basis, right? So that's my first thing I want you to think about. So my name is Helen Fitzmaurice. I am a researcher at UC Berkeley. I actually got a PhD in the sciences, not in education, but before I got my PhD, I was a high school science teacher in Pittsburgh. And what I do now is I work with a group of teachers in Oakland called Oakland Teachers Advancing Climate Action. The second thing that I want you to picture is 3 smokestacks. The 3 smokestacks that I'm thinking about are actually those in an abandoned PG&E facility that is in Pittsburgh. And in about 2013, 2014, a group wanted to come in and turn that abandoned facility into a crude oil terminal. There was community organizing to stop that project, and myself and my students got involved in that. Part of the thing we had to do was actually get air quality data, because the closest Bay Area Air Quality Management District sensor was in Concord. And so the people filing an environmental impact report saying, we're gonna bring these fossil fuels into a neighborhood where your students live. Like literally next to the fence is like a church, an elementary school, people's houses, right? You're bringing in crude by rail and by boat. We're gonna use an air sensor from miles and miles away. So my students took air quality data, and they brought that data to the city council. They made fact sheets to educate people in their city. They went door-to-door canvassing. And that's gonna be my answer to you about what can climate education look like. It looks like students taking action at the local level, saying, how does this global phenomenon impact me and my community? And in Pittsburgh, like most of the rest of the US, the kids that are most impacted are not affluent white kids, right? They are Black and brown kids, mostly. They are low-income kids. And there are historical, structural reasons why that happens. So the education that we need is helping those kids feel like they can make a difference, and also helping the kids whose parents work at Apple in Fremont understand what's going on, and that the difference they need to make is not buying an electric car, but changing our systems in a rapid way, like our last speaker talked about.
1 minute.
All right. I want you to picture a mountain and like one teacher trying to do this. And that's not me. You know, that is every teacher trying to do this. What we need, this is climate adaptation. regardless of what happens, my son, my 1-year-old, is going to be dealing with the consequences of climate change. And we need to educate kids in a supportive way that helps them work towards that future. We need to support teachers. We need to support local community groups that work with teachers and students, and we need to support students directly. So thanks for listening. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. There's a lot still to come, but it is 10 after 7. We're now going to take a 10-minute break and then start right up right at 7:21. Thank you. be resuming in 2 more minutes. Okay, if the relevant hearing officials can make their way back to their assigned seats. Okay, very good. Thank you very much for reconvening. Eric, would you introduce the next couple speakers, please?
Yes. All right. Welcome back, everyone. So tonight we've heard from a lot of excellent experts in the room. We are also honored to have a couple people from our youth community here today. And we have 2 members of our Hayward Youth Commission. These are people who are appointed by the City Council to participate in one of Hayward's most important commissions. So first we have Temi Ogukami, and we have some slides that we probably just need to, and the clicker is right there on the dais.
Press it? Okay.
Welcome.
And I'll just give it 1 minute here. Okay, perfect.
Okay, so my presentation's on what more should the U.S. do on climate change, and this is from a teen's perspective. So my name is Temiloluwa Ogunkami, but you can call me Tammy. I'm in the Hayward Youth Commission, and we focus on teens issues. So it's been said a countless number of times that youth are the future of this world. Climate change is an issue that can't be solved in an instant because it's not a problem that was created immediately. So it'll take the future generation to reverse the damage of climate change, but there are still things the US can do now. So the first thing, point number 1, would be to get people to care. In order for action to take place, there needs to be a cause, and I feel like many youth feel that climate change is out of our control or only an issue for adults. So some of the ways to fight this stigma are through education and giving youth more opportunities to participate in environmental topics. So I would think for education, like incorporating more classes or lessons regarding environmental topics such as sustainability, global warming, or like sustainable fashion would be good. Special lessons, contests, field trips, pickups, and events related to environment, especially during Earth Month, would be really good for children to get excited about issues like this. Okay. So for point number 2, I think promoting sustainable transportation for youth would also be a good thing. So as we know, walking and biking are probably the most effective ways to reduce emissions. But also e-bikes and e-scooters also a great way of transportation. They're really like trending right now, so that would be also a good way. And also promoting public transport, such as like buses or trains, and maybe like the BART 2 in Bay Area would also be helpful. And then also promoting, let's say if you can't take that, carpooling with people, and hybrid and electric cars are also a great way to reduce emissions. So the city of Hayward right now is already working on getting bikes for students, and Hard has a bike trail, so we hope to see the effects of this in the future years. And the third and last final point would probably be to support youth-led initiatives. So I feel like support goes a long way for people. So supporting projects, clubs, committees, and spaces for youth to just talk about environment and all topics related to that would help, I guess, get it out more and help people to participate and help with the environmental crisis. And then these are some quotes that I liked about the environment. And then these are my resources, and then that's it.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Our next speaker, also from the Hayward Youth Commission, is Josue Barrera.
Good afternoon, everyone present with us tonight. My name is Josue Barrera, and I'm a member of the HYC, or the Hayward Youth Commission. Before starting, I would like to thank Mr. Pearson for giving me the opportunity to take the floor tonight. Growing up, I was always an enthusiast for nature. I was intrigued to go out and explore our natural environment. Those memories have played a crucial role in my knowledge and care of nature that I'll share with you tonight. I remember those afternoons watching the sunset around the Bay Area, while always enjoying having conversations with my family about the world that was out there. It is clear that our environment plays a major role in our day-to-day lives. Yet, I stand here tonight to inform you that our home is endangered. Climate change has always been a problem throughout the history of humanity. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have created a bomb that will slowly explode if we don't take action. It's at a point that we're at the brink of a major mass extinction for us humans. Signs are clear of catastrophic consequences. Global warming has shown its impact around the globe, especially in our state. Wildfires every year have grown and shown their impact throughout the summertime when the brushes are at their driest point. This has caused a large amount of debt and damages for the state, considering the power post malfunctioning and many people being left without electricity. This can put in danger many lives of those who rely on the power source for medical issues. Additionally, the consequences of this will be forests that can't produce enough clean air and landslides throughout major cities, including Santa Rosa and Napa. The consequences in our city are also being shown with the abnormal activity of the weather, when this is the time where we're supposed to enjoy the most. Our sunny summer days are reaching record high temperatures, not common for our area. This has left many of our city residents confused and worried in how they will stay safe and cool during the summer. Just last year, during early 2023, we had a major storm for which we were not fully prepared. My fear is that soon our city will become a birthplace for tropical storms, risking floods to create washing out foundations of many buildings and risking lives of people who live in the city or that our major fires will be created. As I mentioned before, all of this are early signs of catastrophic events to come if we don't decide to take action. This is just the beginning of an uninhabitable environment we will create if we don't change our habits from here in 20 years. One that your children and grandchildren will remember as a living slaughter. According to an article called The Effect of Climate Change, published by nc.nasa.gov, the potential future effects of global climate change include more frequent wildfires, longer periods of droughts in some regions, and an increase in the wind intensity and rainfall from tropical cyclones. One change that we have already discussed with our city council members and commissioners is the implementation of bikes for teenage students. Students in Hayward will each get provided with bikes to ride to their campuses starting from middle school. This change will also come as the city wants to prevent risk of accidents and reduction of greenhouse gases produced. This implements healthy habits to our environment by not polluting but decreasing the risk of gases that create abnormal weather in our area. Additionally, we create a more healthier generations as students are having to bike daily to school. For our wildfire issues, we could start having discussions with our counties around the state about the implication of underground electric lines. These ideas are already in use up north by PG&E, where wildfires are a daily threat to our forests. This could then hopefully lead into projects that will innovate this type of system into many single lines that run around the state. We intend that this system gets popularized around the nation, with the expectation that one day we become an all-electric dependent country that runs on high storage solar detectors and wind farms as a source of energy.
1 minute.
Lastly, we could try to restore the damage we have already done by reintroducing wildlife and fauna. This could be in between certain periods in the year where communities around the city gather to plant, clean, reintroduce wildlife, and attend to the needs of our natural environment. The funding would have to come slightly from the budgets of our city departments like City, Parks and Recreation, Library, etc. Our volunteering window can open 3 months prior, as we hope to make this a mass event that we gather volunteers from high schools, wildlife departments, and local businesses who are seeking to help out. I'm here as a person tonight who will be impacted by these consequences if the people in power don't take action in this instance. The future starts with you, with this decision tonight, starting right here in this amazing city, which has a major impact not only for our state, but for our entire nation. I leave this floor tonight trusting everyone present here with a responsibility, not only for our future generations, but for our entire globe to make change to save our home. It is indeed true when they say one small change can make a major difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very powerful statement and trusting all of us to do what we must. Before turning it over to the next person to introduce our next speaker, I want to thank from the city of Hayward, Linda and Geraldine for all of your work. Joe also is somewhere helping, and then there's another technical genius behind the scenes whose name I can't remember who's helping.
We have Nick in the back.
Nick in the back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. They're terrific partners. And then I want to thank to my left my colleague Kaylee Martin. Kaylee is our is CPR Initiatives communications specialist, and she has done so much to help organize today's hearing and keep things running. Thank you so much, Kaylee. And then, and then Nelson Bonner. Nelson is a founding board member of CPR Initiative, and actually he's traveled all the way here from San Jose to help with this hearing. Thank you, Nelson. And Nelson will introduce our next speaker, who is going to be by videotape.
Yes. Thank you, Dan. Yes, it's my privilege to introduce Kumi Naidoo. Kumi is in South Africa at the moment, so he's going to be testifying via a pre-recorded video. Kumi was born in Durban, South Africa in the mid-1960s under apartheid. And as a 15-year-old, he was arrested numerous times for organizing school boycotts and mass mobilizations against the racist regime, and had to go underground and eventually into exile. This brought him to the UK and to Oxford, where he became a Rhodes Scholar and earned his PhD in political sociology. After Nelson Mandela's release in 1990, Kumi returned to South Africa to assist with legalizing the African National Congress as a political party and to lead adult literacy and voting education campaigns. He served as the official spokesperson of the Independent Electoral Commission, which was in charge of South Africa's first democratic election in 1994. Kumi is a world-renowned climate justice activist and a leader, and has served in numerous NGO capacities, most notably as CEO of Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation, founder of Global Call to Action Against Poverty. He worked with Greenpeace in the Arctic as an activist occupying oil platforms at Shell, Gazprom, and Cairn Energy, and then he became the executive director of Greenpeace. Subsequently, he was the Secretary General of Amnesty International. He was a founding chair and currently the global ambassador of Africans Rising, which is a climate justice organization. His first book, Boiling Point: Can Citizen Action Save the World?, investigates the climate crisis and proposes global citizen action as a response. He's a visiting fellow at Oxford University and an honorary fellow at Magdalen College. Currently, he serves as Payne Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And he wanted me to be sure to mention that he is a member of the Ricky Rick Foundation for the Promotion of Artivism, which is the application of artistic imagination and perspective to climate and social justice activism. So here now is Kumi's testimony via video.
Dear friends and colleagues, I'm pleased to be able to offer a testimony to the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative hearings. The first thing I want to say is that the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that emerges justifiably from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be overcome by the courage of our thoughts, our actions, our creativity, and so on. Today, the United States has a distinctive role to play in the world. As one of the largest emitters historically, the US has to step up now after decades of foot dragging to ensure that they join with other countries around the world to push for a bold climate solution. One of the reasons we have not been succeeding with climate justice activism is the fact that often when we are trying to move, educate, and get people engaged, we tend to rely far too much on science, facts and figures, rational arguments, policies, and so on. Of course, all of this is important. But one of the mistakes we've been making is that most of our interventions are aimed at the brain and we ignore the heart, body, and soul. And it's critically important that if we want to advance climate justice considerations, if we want to advance climate restoration, we have to be connecting climate with other aspects of people's lives. That is, to forge the intersectionality between addressing climate and job creation, addressing climate and gender equity, addressing climate and democracy, addressing climate and having a fair economic system. All of these issues now must be addressed with greater courage and tenacity by folks in the United States as well as all around the world. The reality is already in 2015, people were chanting in many parts of the global south, 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive. By 2016, the slogan had changed to 1.5, we might survive. So given that we are at 1.4 degrees already and pushing on 1.5, we have to recognize that time is not on our side. And the reality is the window of opportunity to turn things around is small and closing very fast. And therefore, it's critical that we look not only at what we have done in the past to advance climate action, but we also have to look at what we need to do differently. And one of the things that I think we have to do if we want to engage the largest numbers of people in the most passionate ways is that we have to move them in their very hearts, bodies, and souls. And for that reason, we have to bring the worlds of arts, culture, and activism, what some of us call energizing artivism, as a way to reach people. We cannot reach people through scientific arguments and policy prescriptions alone. We have to make connections with people about their children's futures, raising the fact that what is at stake is not that, save the planet, save the climate, save the environment. The reality is the planet needs no saving. If we continue on the suicidal trajectory that we are on, the end result is we will be gone, the planet will be years still. And in fact, for all those who are concerned about saving the planet, let me just say, if we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So let's be very, very clear that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more and nothing less than protecting our children and their children's future. And that should motivate us to the highest levels of creativity, courage, and action. So we have to ensure moving forward that all our interventions are about educating at mass scale people in creative and motivational ways so that they'll want to get involved and be part of the solution. People have considerable power as litigators, as citizens and voters, as formers of social movements, and so on. When we look at what's needed is we have to harness the autonomy of our citizenship, we have to harness our creative participation, we also have to harness our wealth. We must not underestimate that when we can aggregate our numbers, go to banks and say to banks that you should not be lending to the destruction of our children's future, we can have success. We can also need to harness our consumption power. All of these offers multiple pathways in which people can participate and make a difference. I would end by saying that the reality that we face right now is that the clock is ticking and the window is closing. However, one of the ways we can get accelerated action is by following the money and shutting the flow at capital at source. So our energies, especially in places like the United States and Europe where the finance sector is very powerful, we need to ensure that we shut the flow of capital at source, ensure that no money is flowing to oil, coal, gas, and other climate-destroying economic projects. I would like to end by saying to all of you who are attending this, there are days when you might feel down. There are days when you might feel that it's not worth struggling for restoring our climate to what it was. But I want to say to you that the struggle for justice is a marathon and not a sprint. And I want to say to you that you, people attending this hearing, offer to both America and the world as a whole hope that there are people in the world who are willing to act with courage to ensure that we can secure this planet for our children and their children's future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kumi. Very, very powerful statement. Our next speaker is Don Viviani. Don is a retired Environmental Protection Agency scientist and policy director, retired after 35 years of service at EPA. Don actually served as director of its Climate Policy Assessment Division, and over the course of his work there, he ran numerous other divisions and branches in every media at the agency. Don here serves as president of the CPR Initiative Board of Advisors, and he and his wife, Wendy, also an activist with CPR Initiative, volunteer activist, have traveled here from Honolulu. Thank you very much, Don.
Sure. Says, okay, on the monitor is a view of a dystopian future where a man explains to some kids, yeah, the planet was destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Now, is this funny or is this a prophecy? It sort of depends on what we do in the next decade or so. Everything we just heard about, climate tipping, the shutdown of the AMOC, extreme weather, SLR, should convince you that real emission reductions aren't needed in 5 years or 10 years, but right now. We're not cutting emissions fast enough, and why is that? I think it's because governments are being pulled in opposite directions. On one hand, towards returning a stable climate to our kids, and on the other, towards maintaining investments in fossil resources. The cartoon got it right. Shareholder value is the obstacle. To be fair, these fossil resources are integral to our economy, but they don't have to be. Why we're in this fix is obvious, but the path forward really isn't. Everything we heard about, the extreme weather, et cetera, they're all terrifying. But what really drives the need for speed, the need for both a rapid reduction in emissions and a drawdown of atmospheric greenhouse gases, are the tipping elements that Professor Lenton described earlier. What's going to happen isn't mysterious. The physical, chemical, and energy flow aspects of the climate system are like rocks on a hillside. Once they start sliding, seeking a lower energy state, they bring other rocks along with them. And they don't stop until they reach the bottom, and we can't live at the bottom. At some point, humankind will lose control because these flows, as they proceed, are self-amplifying. They reduce solar reflection, they add new greenhouse gases, and these are the other rocks I was talking about, and warming gets a lot worse. The time to stop an avalanche is before it starts. If we allow these tipping elements to become irreversible, future reductions in emissions won't stop the slide to a hostile climate. Now, the spigot to reduce emissions only can be turned by two different hands. One, the owners of the fossil resources, the corporations and investors, they control the extraction and supply. And two, governments, they can put limits on extraction and use. The owners of fossil resources are very unlikely saviors. They knew the dangers in the late 70s. They did nothing, even though their own scientists predicted catastrophic impacts unless fossil energy decreased significantly. They were also aware in the early 80s that the progression could be irreversible if emissions weren't reduced. So they knew about tipping. Did they develop alternate energy solutions? Look beyond petroleum? Nah. They denied and discredited their own science and raised doubt in the public's mind about the causes of global warming. Since the 70s, the extraction and use of fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions have increased every year, as you can see on the chart. Regulatory action is the only option left. Almost all government action up to now has been incentives, all carrots, like electric vehicle rebates, but no stick. Asking has proven too slow. It's time for telling. EPA has a stick, but it's not using it. The stick is called TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act. Congress passed TSCA to protect us from substances that pose an unreasonable risk to health and the environment. Basically, it's a Chemical Safety Act. The amount of fossil fuels extracted and the greenhouse gases released are the most unsafe substances humanity has ever inflicted on itself. And climate change's existential risk can't be considered reasonable. It's almost like TSCA was written with climate change in mind. Our group, CPRI, has and will keep trying through petitions in the courts to force EPA to use TSCA authority. TSCA is like a Swiss Army knife for climate. Under its authority, EPA can write rules limiting emissions, set carbon fees, require legacy carbon removal, and require that imports meet these same rules. EPA has a chemical safety law. Let's use it for the climate's most unsafe chemicals. We are watching our opportunity to fix the climate crisis die a slow death. Government action, emission reduction, and carbon removal all need CPR. Go to cprclimate.org. Read why we think TSCA can be the ruby slippers EPA can click to get us back to a stable climate. EPA is a pollution reduction agency. It needs to reduce this pollution before it's too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Don. Appreciate that.
All right, so our next speaker is on Zoom. We have Elaine Salinger.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we
my,
can.
My video will not start. So my name is Elaine Salinger. I'm a retired veterinarian, and I also lead the San Mateo County chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. And while I would love the EPA to regulate us out of this misery, this mess, we've seen recently how the Supreme Court can tie the hands of the EPA. It's a wonderful idea to ask the EPA to act, but it is even better to ask for legislation to stop climate change. What legislation? Because you want to go for the big guns first. And if you look at a website, a climate change simulator website that was created by MIT and Sloan called En-ROADS, and I ask all of you to check it out. It's EN-ROADS, Climate Interactive. You will see that clearly we need all possible solutions, but that the single most effective solution is pricing carbon. And there's a socially just way to do that, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think that we really need a price on carbon. We need a market solution. There is one clear winner. This particular solution, if it were a global solution, would reduce the average global temperature by 0.9 degrees centigrade. Now, granted, we're talking about legislation in the United States, but this is clearly the winner. This is the most effective solution. And how do you do that? Well, there's a bill waiting for a vote in the House now called the Energy Innovation Act. And it is the socially just way to price carbon, where the government collects the carbon price, but doesn't keep it and returns it equally to all people. I also want to mention that it is important that we vote for climate champions. And there's a little secret about how to tell if someone is a climate champion. You look at their website. If all they're talking about is adaptation and they're not talking about reducing emissions, they are not a climate champion. I invite you to join Citizens Climate Lobby and learn how you can take easy action to get a carbon price passed in the House and the Senate. It can be very easy using tools that groups have developed, like Citizens Climate Lobby. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And Citizens Climate Lobby National was a strong supporter of our effort, of course, in 2022. And we really appreciate the work of Citizens Climate Lobby. And so now the next speaker is Shamak Gauda. Shamak, are you here?
He's
yes,
on Zoom.
online.
Very good. And you have 2 minutes.
All right, thank you. I'm Shamak. I'm a high schooler from Fremont. I'm also part of Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm part of the Silicon Valley East chapter. I just wanted to thank the youth that spoke before. You guys are really awesome. And I wanted to kind of emphasize, just student action, student engagement. So what I wanted to talk about was something that we at Citizens Climate Lobby started in the youth action team. So we started this campaign for schools, for students to create resolutions at their schools about electrifying their schools. So the place where students are really prioritized the most is, or it should be, their schools, right? And schools also happen to be one of those big time emitters in the public sector. So that was kind of our goal to, for students to kind of exercise their voice in their schools and get their schools to electrify, whether it be through, electric school buses, heat pumps, induction stovetops, and kitchens. So that was kind of the goal of the challenge. And so I just wanted to emphasize that, I'm just an organizer, but I wanted to thank all of our student teams across the nation. So it was really them that put this together. And so that's kind of what I wanted to show, that the power of a student is basically limitless. And especially within a school, a student has the power to do anything. So that's kind of my first point. And also, so that's kind of with electrification. But the other thing is that even if we are electrified, we still have to increase transmission capacity. So one of the things that I learned with CCL is about permitting reform. So that's kind of a way for us to speed up projects that would increase our transmission capacity, and among other things, just increase the possibility for clean energy projects. So that ties hand in hand with electrification. So that's also one thing that I'm I'm looking forward to. So there's recently a bill in Congress called the Permitting Reform Bill of 2024. So I recently heard about that, and I'm just excited for the U.S. to continue supporting permitting reform legislation. So what I'm trying to say is the power of a student to create change in their school is just really, really important, and we should keep encouraging students to do that. While at the same time, we as a country, we continue to support their work and to provide them with the resources that they need. So yeah, that's basically it. Thank you everyone for hearing me.
Thank you very much, Shamak. Our next speaker is Jim Clark. I don't know if Jim, oh, he is here, all right.
Hi, my name is Jim Clark, and you're all very nice people. However, I disagree with you. And so I only have 2 minutes, so I've got to go fast. The globalist elites have been pushing the climate change narrative for decades now, consistently warning us of impending doom if we don't reduce our standard of living. The World Economic Forum's Klaus Schwab boldly states that in 2030, you will not own anything. You will be tax slaves quartered in economic zones, and you will need to get a license from the state to have children. This would be merely comical if we were not witnessing our federal, state, and local governments all falling in line to implement this. In spite of their climate change rhetoric, the true belief of both corporations and governments is clear. Google has admitted it is behind on its goal of reducing net carbon emissions by 2030. In fact, their emissions are up by 50% due to the massive and energy-intensive infrastructure build-out of AI systems. Tech companies in the Bay Area and most companies around the country, after seeing massive productivity increases in 2020 through 2022 during the COVID lockdown years, insisted that their employees get back out on the highways and with their carbon-emitting vehicles and commute to work.
1 minute.
While cities around the Bay Area, including Hayward, have policies in place to put our roads on a diet, deliberately reducing capacity of the roads and increasing carbon emissions for each car now in stop-and-go traffic. Meanwhile, emergency services like fire, medical, and security response times are negatively affected. When I pressed our former Mayor Halliday why this is happening, she announced that we are trying to get people out of their cars. In other words, the city's policies are designed to frustrate and punish the citizens with nonsense edicts of the elite few, while at the same time claiming they support a democracy. It is clear that the elites and policymakers don't believe in climate change narrative. In fact, they created it in order to deprive people like you and me of their life, wealth, and liberty while they fly to and fro in their private jets. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for your statement. The next speaker is Dan Heil. Welcome, Dan, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Many people these days look for the next big solution, specifically in the area of climate change and solutions for climate change. But humans don't necessarily need the next big solution. We just need to use and work with the solutions we already have. One of those we can implement immediately, which is insulation. Building codes can be updated to increase the required insulation in buildings. This can be implemented as early as tomorrow by any city that chooses to make the change. Additionally, wall structures can be increased from basic 2x4 walls to a simple 2x6 wall or a 2x6 plus 2x4 double wall. We just need governments to get on board with this. Secondly, in the US, there's approximately 8.1 billion square meters, of suitable rooftop for the installation of solar photovoltaic panels. This could generate roughly 40% of the yearly need, 4 trillion kilowatts that the US uses every year. Installing PV panels on the rooftops in North America, and I say North America specifically, is an initial goal to providing power and jobs to hundreds of thousands of people.
1 minute.
We can also encourage every nation in the world can easily install sufficient panels up to the daily power limit for each country, and that can be done in conjunction with the existing power systems. But that's going to require better power grids. So specifically for North America, we need a new grid design. And we need a grid design that looks at all of our power sources, both now and in the future, and is designed to do that. Repairs and upgrades going forward should line up with that new design, and any that do not line up should not be funded. Instead, those funds should support the change to the new grid design. And since this is directed to the EPA, the message is mining. Mining metals needed to support EV cars, PV panels, and a revised power grid is key to an electrified future. The EPA needs to get on board with increased mining of the materials that are needed for those activities and get those moving. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Our next speaker is Abe Masliach. Abe, thank you very much, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, CPR Initiative and the City of Hayward for hosting this public hearing and inviting Silicon Valley East Chapter of Citizen Climate Lobby to testify this evening. My name is Abe Masliach. I live in Fremont, California, and I'm a lead for the Silicon Valley East Chapter. I'm happy to see that a volunteer from CCL has testified at each of the last 3 public hearings. Since the first hearing in November 1st of 2022, representatives from CCL have testified that a carbon fee and dividend act is the fastest way to reduce CO2 emissions in the United States. The current bill, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act of 2023, H.R. 5744, now has 29 co-sponsors. Great news.
1 minute.
Yesterday, Congressman Eric Swalwell, our chapter's representative, became a co-sponsor of this bill. We need Congress to move forward on this bill as soon as possible. The Inflation Reduction Act provides tax credits and soon rebates for residents to electrify their homes by upgrading their gas appliances to electric and installing rooftop solar. The public is generally not aware of these incentives, and much more needs to be done to educate, inform, and promote these benefits. It is taking much too long for the IRA rebates to be available to residents. The U.S. needs to speed up the pace of building electrification and make it affordable for low and middle income homes to become more efficient or electrified. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Marlise Connell.
And Marlise, you have 2 minutes.
I would like to say good evening to everybody. I've been a resident of Hayward for 28 years. I am a committed person to the earth. We hang our clothes out. I have a natural garden. I have no pesticides. I just killed some ants with a natural pesticide. So I'm also Native American, I'm African, and I'm European, because I don't want to be put in a box. So I am going to provide a different perspective. There is not a 97% consensus. That is manufactured. There are many dissenting scientists. We're not hearing from them. We're not hearing another perspective. And I have to say, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to be able to compete with these, elite, educated people. So there's very many different perspectives. I brought my favorite, which is Judith Curry. She was a dedicated environmentalist, climate scientist, but she came across other information that challenged her and changed her mind, because scientific debate is what we're supposed to be having.
1 minute.
But we're not having it. So there are other factors that contribute to our climate change. You don't hear about these. There's solar, there is volcanoes, there are swirls within the ocean. I can't even name them all. There's quite a bit. The other thing about this climate policy in Alameda is it's about controlling you. It's invading your privacy, taking away what you can do and not do. On one of the pages that I picked out, with low-income housing, it takes away their parking. So if you're low-income and poor, you're going to be forced to be on this agenda. It is not about care of the earth. It's about controlling us. If they cared about the earth, they would stop everybody from spraying Roundup. They haven't done that. Stop eating blueberries in the winter and stop buying a damn apple from New Zealand, because that is bullshit. If you can't stop that, you don't care about the earth. Stop all these foreign importing food companies that are here in Hayward. We don't need foods from China. We don't need foods from India. We grow rice here in California. So if you're spraying Roundup, don't have an organic garden, and hawks in your backyard, you really don't care. Please stop eating fruit out of season. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marlise. The next speaker is Sarah Amanoff. And welcome, Sarah. You have 2 minutes.
I do my best. So I'm a teacher. Just a little info about me. I actually work with Greenpeace and Sierra Club. And I also have a different perspective. I work with Safe Tech International as well. And we are just shocked at the huge, giant energy expenditures of all the new technologies that go into all the new cars. So anyway, we are... So even if we cut emissions to zero overnight, if we continued to degrade the Earth, the planet will die a death of 1 million cuts. That's Eisenstein. So it seems like there's just concern about green economy, and it looks like we are citizens, not citizens, but we're consumers. So most people think we're going to solve the planetary crisis by replacing fossil fuels with solar, wind, and batteries. Yet all our technologies require 17 rare earth minerals that are finite and toxic to mine. And such as cobalt in the Congo, where you have like little kids that are knee deep in the mud, so you guys can have your new cell phone, your new whatever. Everyone talks about new infrastructure.
1 minute.
And anyway, so I'm gonna tell you that they don't have the resilience in environments that are harsh. For example, EV vehicles break down, the end usage is not looked at, they're hard to get rid of, they're toxic, they use a lot of resources to be made, they're not in for the long haul, they're throwaways, they never talk about the end life of solar panels. There are certain weather that destroys the panels. For example, in Texas, they got hail, now they got rid of all the solar panels. They create a wasteland of water shedding, all kinds of heavy metals that go into the wet watershed. So what happens is a domino effect. So that's one thing down this rabbit hole, because we're not looking at true alternatives. We're only looking at some corporate government connection. I'd like to talk about the climate agenda creating food insecurity, which involves removing farmers from the land, AI-driven farmerless farms, filling much of the countryside with wind farms and solar panels, displacing farmers. And that's really concerning, because the food transition involves locking farmers, at least those who will remain in farming, further into corporate-controlled agriculture that extracts wealth and serves the market need of global corporations, carbon trading Ponzi schemes, and institutional investors and speculators with no connection to farming who regard agriculture, food commodities, and agricultural land as mere financial assets. And also talked about ozone. Well, you know what? All those satellites, those internet satellites, the rocket launches are killing our ozone layer. We don't talk about that. You know why? Because we're not looking at 5G, which is or the internet. We've exempted that from the equation. That's the biggest energy monster. Also, you talk about in your little thing about the smart grid. The smart grid uses a lot more energy because it goes through the air. Anything that goes through the air uses a lot more energy. So it looks like the solutions. Also, I am going to add this little thing about energy-efficient refrigerators have into IoT, and if you can't disable the IoT, it lasts only for a few years. It's built in obsolescence. Once the IoT dies, you have to replace the refrigerator, and then you have to have more children mining in the Congo, knee-deep in the mud in toxic sludge.
Time.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
All right, our next speaker is Bruce King.
Good evening. I'm Bruce King with Friends of San Lorenzo Creek. We're a local nonprofit that advocates for our local creeks. Climate change is causing much broader swings in the amount of annual and storm-driven precipitation. We had some drought years, but for the last couple years, we've experienced some massive atmospheric rivers that cause flooding, property damage, and fish migration. For example, 3 years ago, we had a massive atmospheric river in October. We had a fall run of Chinook salmon. They were out in the bay, and they said, look at that. We got a big, massive slug of water coming out of San Lorenzo Creek. We had 30 Chinook salmon come up San Lorenzo Creek. They made it 5 miles up here to downtown Hayward, and they reached the restriction at Foothill Boulevard. They couldn't make it into the natural sections of channels, and they all died and couldn't spawn. So we need to improve our channels with fish ladders and in fish enhancements. We also had a massive atmospheric river about a year and a half ago on New Year's Eve. A lot of you locally remembered that. Okay, our local flood control channels here were at the top. They were flowing massive amounts. All the natural streams upstream were at the top of bank. People that lived on the banks of the creek, their backs of their properties were falling in. Structures were falling into the creeks. We had docks flowing over dams at Don Castro. We had a washout of A Street, which took it out for a couple months until we could do emergency repairs. We got big flooding problems. Things are getting flashier.
1 minute.
What do we need to do? Well, Alameda County Flood Control and Water Conservation District is responsible for all of our flood controls locally. Okay? And we haven't seen a long-term plan for them in over 20 years that I've been doing this. But luckily, in July, Flood Control reported a $400 to $700 million backlog in capital improvements that are needed. So they want to come out to the local property owners and propose a flood control benefit assessment increase, a pretty moderate one. And they really need it because the flood control channels and streams can't handle the water. And we also need enhancements for the fish and other environmental improvements. So possibly in 2025, we'll see a local voter ballot come out to the property owners, and I hope people vote for it because it's really a good investment in our infrastructure and a good investment in our streams. And this is an example of how climate change is affecting us locally and costing us money. And if we do invest right, we'll get the right things out of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker is Stanley Wang. Thank you very much, Stanley. And Stanley, you will have 2 minutes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Stanley, and I'm from San Ramon.
I'm an economics graduate student, and I volunteer with Fridays for Future, Sunrise Movement, and the Extinction Rebellion. I've seen the anguish, the despair, the anger that my generation holds over a climate problem that we were born into, that until these past few years, we've had no power to change. I speak today to give my generation hope by talking about a solution from their values, values which I assume many in this room share, on a solution that economists have failed at communicating for years. I favor making polluters pay. For each ton of CO2 Exxon's oil creates, they should pay. In economics, that's a carbon tax. I also believe that money collected should go back to the people because we're all humans and will bear this burden together. This is the best policy for protecting the working class. MIT economist Chris Knittel and Berkeley economist Lucas Davis studied the impacts of gas taxes and fuel economy standards. They find that fuel economy standards hurt low-income households. A gas tax with money returned to the people, that benefits the bottom 80% of Americans. This is directly analogous to a carbon tax. No ban, no standard, no limit is going to help low-income families the way a carbon tax with rebates will.
1 minute.
Now, for anyone who's worried this sounds like a radical commie scheme, it's also good policy for the economy. Economic costs under carbon tax will be half that under other policies. If you care about the economy and about climate change, this is a policy for you too. Lastly, it's best practice for our environment. The IPCC calls it an essential part of any ambitious plan. It's a necessary, if insufficient, part of stopping climate change. It's not too late for us to be a climate leader, but time is running short. I invite my peers and everyone in this room to build the support we need for a federal carbon tax. Without one, we will fail. But more importantly, with one, we can win. Thank you.
And actually, we have one more speaker who I thought was not going to make it, but he has materialized online as well. And this is John Gage. John, you have 2 minutes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the other CCL volunteers that were on earlier. I love the prompt. What more should the U.S. do on climate change? We need to close the U.S. carbon price gap, as Stanley and others have talked about. Carbon pricing is necessary. But what is the gap? And what is the best way to price carbon? And what more should individuals do? You can get this slideshow at the QR code or bit.ly/carbon price gap CPR. And the scientific consensus is real. There is also just a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Who says carbon pricing is necessary? The IPCC, hundreds of climate scientists and economists volunteering their time to study peer-reviewed articles have concluded explicit carbon prices remain a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies. And our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, says we cannot solve the climate crisis without effective carbon pricing. The Hamilton Project reviewed 1,000 potential policies for 2025 and assessed their impact on U.S. emissions. You can see a carbon fee is the clear winner. I think I had 4.5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, John. In fact, you do. I had you in the wrong category. You did have 4.5 minutes. My fault, Nelson. Go ahead, John.
Okay, thanks so much. A carbon fee is by far the most powerful. It works in complementary ways with the IRA. Additional spending doesn't give us nearly the bang for the buck that the first spending of the IRA did. What is the U.S. carbon pricing gap? Well, the IPCC has a minimum price range that hits $135 in 2030 and rises to $690 per ton of CO2 emitted in 2100. Carbon pricing is spreading. It's in over 75 countries and regions. Prices are rising, and CBAMs are starting. That is where a country that prices carbon charges its carbon price on the embedded emissions on imports from free polluting countries. En-ROADS was mentioned before. I'll show 3 quick slide images of it. This is global policies as they exist now, according to the IPCC integrated assessment models. We're headed to a 3.3 degrees future. warmer future. But if you start with a $25 carbon price on carbon and add $10 each year through the century, it takes us halfway to our 1.5 degrees target, down 0.9 degrees. And it makes all the other complementary policies easier to do. When it costs money to pollute, everybody is motivated to demand more ways to stop polluting. How to price carbon is with that carbon fee and dividend policy. Charge a steadily increasing carbon fee at the source, at coal mines, oil refineries, gas consolidators. All the money gets put into a carbon trust and rebated to all households on an equal basis each month. Most families come out ahead financially with a highly progressive result. And then use a CBAM, a border adjustment, to push our carbon price around the world and level the playing field for US producers. Economists, the largest public statement by economists in history supports this approach: a steadily rising carbon fee, a full household equal rebate, and a CBAM. But is it possible? Because the political, ideological, and industrial headwinds are very strong. But Greta Thunberg said, until you start focusing on what needs to be done rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. It's up to us to make carbon fee and dividend possible. So internalize the message. It shouldn't be free to pollute. Give the money back. A CBAM pushes it around the world, and carbon fee and dividend gets us halfway to our global 1.5 degrees goal. Talk about carbon fee and dividend in all your discussions about climate with friends, families, influencers, and legislators. And join Citizens Climate Lobby to help create the political will for a livable world with a specific focus on passing carbon fee and dividend legislation. And for students, here's a great project for a climate club, our environmental club. Put signs all around campus, have events to spread the word about this wonderful policy. Most effective climate policy, carbon fee and dividend, and take action by writing Congress here. As Gregory Mankiw is the author of Economics 101, a book that's taught at universities across the country, says, the closest thing I know to a panacea in the climate change debate is putting a price on carbon and rebating the revenue to citizens. So please ask not what your country should do for you for climate, but ask yourself what you can do for your country for climate. And that is help create the political will for carbon fee and dividend legislation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I'll take a last word here on behalf of Eric and all of his colleagues, on behalf of CPR Initiative. Thank you very much. There are essentially three categories of persons who have come before us and provided very substantial and interesting and important testimony. They are, of course, the invited national and local experts who you heard from. They are the citizen activists in this community and afar, including a number of courageous students who have stood up to defend their right to a viable climate system and future. And of course, there are also a number of citizens with diametrically contrary views who have braved the elites in this room to come and testify before us. Thank you very much as well. On behalf of CPR Initiative, thank you very much. We look forward actually to continuing the partnership with you, Eric, and your colleagues here at the City of Hayward. And lastly, I can say that in the lobby, we will have a short reception. There is coffee and some interesting simple carbohydrates. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight.
Recording stopped.